Get the hell out of my way, you pathetic little charity case! Isabella's voice was a shard of ice in the cavernous great hall, a sound more violent than the nor'easter that was trying to tear the Greenwich estate from its foundations. Rain, driven by a furious wind, machine-gunned against the two-story Palladian windows. Outside, ancient oaks thrashed like tormented giants, the storm's fury a perfect roaring echo of the woman's venom. If you've ever felt powerless against someone spitting poison like that, someone who thinks their money makes them a god, then smash that like button and tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone, and your location might just show you that someone near you is watching this very video, feeling the exact same thing. Cassandra Vance, just 28 years old, stood her ground. Her body, trembling but unyielding, was a living shield before the frail form of Arthur Sterling. At 82, the old man, once a decorated captain who had stared down death in the frozen forests of Bastogne, now clung to Cassie's sleeve. His breath was a shallow whisper against the storm, his skin as pale and translucent as fine china beneath the cruel, glittering light of 1,000 crystal chandelier. He whispered the words that had become his anchor, the mantra that had carried him through hell and back. "Hold the line, soldier." Isabella's eyes, the color of a winter sky, burned with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. Her gown, a river of emerald silk, shimmered with her every seething breath. Diamonds, cold and merciless, flashed at her throat and wrists, but her beauty was a predator's camouflage. "You dare to stand there?" she sneered, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You dare to act as if you are anything more than the dirt I allow to exist on my floors?" Then, her voice climbed, becoming a shrill, venomous shriek that filled the hall, silencing the very thunder for a heartbeat. "I wish you were dead already. I wish you would just die so I could have all of this for myself." The words struck the air like a physical blow, vibrating against the cold marble and imported mahogany. They were a raw, naked declaration of greed, a sentiment so ugly it seemed to stain the very air. Arthur's head lifted. He was weak, his body a battlefield of time and illness, but the soldier within him was unbroken. His voice trembled, yet it carried the phantom echo of command, the ghost of a bark that had once sent men charging into gunfire. "You will not see that wish fulfilled," he rasped, each word a monumental effort. "Not while I draw breath, not while the truth still has a soldier standing guard." At the far end of the corridor, cloaked in the deep shadows beyond an archway, Julian Sterling stood frozen. The 45-year-old billionaire had returned home early from a business trip to Tokyo, his footsteps swallowed by the tempest of voices. He watched, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sickening cocktail of disbelief and dread churning in his gut. He saw Cassie, the quiet, unassuming caregiver he'd hired, standing like a Praetorian guard, shielding his father from the incandescent rage of his own wife. Isabella's fury, denied its primary target, boiled over. With a guttural scream, she hurled her half-full glass of Cabernet directly at Arthur. It was a thoughtless, reptilian strike. But in that split second, Cassie moved. She flung her arm up, stepping directly into the path of the projectile. The heavy crystal glass struck her forearm with a sickening crack and shattered. Crystal and crimson exploded against the white carpet. Shards, like vicious little teeth, bit deep into her skin. Blood, dark and shocking, streaked down her arm, mingling with the deep red of the wine. Arthur gasped, a strangled, horrified sound. "Cassie!" Isabella, now completely unhinged, lunged forward. She seized Cassie by her wounded arm, her fingers digging into the broken skin, and slammed her against the cold, unforgiving wall. The sound of her hand cracking across Cassie's face was sharp and ugly, followed by another brutal slap across her shoulder. "Beg!" Isabella shrieked, her face a mask of triumphant cruelty. "Beg all you want. You dare to defy me? You stand in my way? You are nothing. You are staff. Hired help." If your blood is boiling right now for this young woman, please prove you have a heart and hit that like button. Let the algorithm know that decency still matters. Cassie sobbed, her body racked with pain and shock, her voice a broken plea. "Please, ma'am, don't hurt him. He just needs peace. Please, stop." But Isabella was lost to her rage, striking again and again, each blow a release of some deep, festering poison within her. Her words were as cruel as her hands, stabbing with surgical precision. "Pathetic girl. You'll bleed for him, and you'll still lose. This house, this fortune, it's all mine." It was then that Julian could remain a shadow no longer. He rushed in, his voice a thunderclap that finally pierced the storm of violence. "Isabella, stop!" He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, halting another strike mid-air. His powerful presence filled the room, but his face was a canvas of confusion, his eyes darting from his snarling wife to Cassie's bleeding form, then to his trembling, ashen-faced father. Isabella's expression shifted in the blink of an eye. The rabid fury vanished, replaced by a mask of sharp, calculated innocence. Her voice, though still tight, was now laced with the poison of a lie. "Julian, thank God, she attacked your father. I caught her red-handed. Look at the blood! She meant to harm him!" Cassie staggered forward, clutching her bleeding arm, her voice desperate and fractured. "No. That's not true. I was protecting him. She tried to hurt Mr. Sterling. Please, you have to believe me." Tears, hot and furious, streamed down her face, her words breaking against the sheer, overwhelming weight of the accusation. Julian's jaw tightened. He was torn. The sight of blood, the chaos, the primal fear for his father's well-being, it created a fog that clouded reason. His voice, heavy with the authority he wielded in boardrooms and across continents, cut through Cassie's pleas like a guillotine. "Enough, Cassie. You've gone too far. You're dismissed. Leave this house at once." The words hit harder than any of Isabella's blows. Cassie's legs felt like they might buckle. Her eyes, wide and filled with a pain deeper than any physical wound, stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, please. I beg you. I would never harm him. Please." But her voice cracked, dissolving into sobs. Pressing a hand against her wound to staunch the bleeding, she bowed her head in defeat and stumbled from the room, her cries a haunting echo that trailed down the long, opulent corridor. Isabella pressed herself against Julian's chest, manufacturing tears with theatrical skill. "You did the right thing, darling," she murmured into his suit jacket. "She was dangerous. She had us all fooled." Julian said nothing. He stared at the crimson stain on the floor, a Rorschach test of blood and wine, his thoughts a tangled, chaotic mess of shadows and doubt. In the servants' quarters, whispers ignited like sparks in dry tinder. Some spoke with fear, their voices trembling. "Did you hear? Cassie struck Mr. Sterling." Others, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and morbid satisfaction, shook their heads. She was always too bold, always looking for favor, yet a few sat in silence, a deep sorrow in their eyes, knowing the truth of Isabella's cruelty, but too terrified of losing their own livelihoods to voice it. One young maid whispered to another, her words a chilling premonition. If it could happen to her, it could happen to any of us. And so, as the nor'easter howled its mournful song outside, the Sterling estate fell into an uneasy, suffocating quiet. Blood and broken crystal still marred the marble floor, the cloying smell of wine and fear hanging heavy in the air. Arthur's frail voice tried to rise, to shout the truth, but it faded into a choked silence, his body too weak to challenge the colossal lie that had just taken root. Cassie's sobs echoed faintly from the distance, fading as she left the only home she had known for 3 years. The storm raged on, but within the walls of the Sterling estate, a different, more insidious storm had just begun, a storm of betrayal, fear, and a chilling injustice that would not pass so easily. The massive carved oak doors of the Sterling mansion closed behind Cassie with a hollow, final thud. For the first time in 3 years, she was on the outside, looking in. The rain had intensified, a relentless, soul-chilling curtain that soaked her simple uniform in seconds. She pressed one hand against the wound on her arm, the sting of broken glass burning sharper in the cold, wet air. Her tears mixed with the downpour, blurring her vision of the glowing mansion behind her, its marble halls now alive with whispers and lies. Ahead of her stretched only darkness. The long, winding driveway curled down the Greenwich hillside, slick with water and veiled in shadows. She pulled her thin coat tighter, a futile gesture against the biting wind. Each step felt like dragging the weight of the entire world. Isabella's shrieks, Arthur's trembling defense, the glass shattering, Julian's cold, stern voice cutting her down. "You're dismissed. Leave this house at once." The words replayed in her mind, a cruel, unending refrain. Cassie clenched her teeth, whispering through chattering lips, "I didn't do anything wrong. God knows I didn't." But the storm, like the man who had condemned her, did not answer. Inside the mansion, Julian stood in the corridor long after Cassie had vanished, his pulse a frantic drum against his ribs. Isabella clung to him, her performance of a terrified wife unwavering. But Julian's eyes kept straying to the evidence on the floor. The glittering shards of crystal, the dark trail of blood leading to the door, and the image seared into his memory of his father's frail hand, trembling as it reached toward the empty hallway where Cassie had disappeared. That single, silent gesture unsettled him more than all of Isabella's frantic words. Later that night, long after Isabella was asleep in their wing of the house, a gnawing doubt drove Julian to the estate's security office. He bypassed the night staff and accessed the system himself, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He demanded the surveillance footage from the cameras positioned discreetly outside his father's suite. The screens flickered to life. He watched, his jaw tightening until it ached. He saw it all. Cassie, standing firm, a bastion of quiet strength. Isabella's face, contorted with rage. He saw his wife's hand hurl the glass not in defense, but in a fit of pure, unadulterated malice. He saw her shove and strike Cassie, again and again. He saw Cassie's body absorb every blow without a single move of retaliation. Her only concern, the old man cowering behind her. Julian's heart plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. The truth was there, undeniable, recorded in cold, digital clarity. He had been a fool. At dawn, Julian confronted Isabella in the grand study. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside washed clean, but a new storm was about to break within the mansion's walls. "I saw everything, Isabella," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. "The cameras, they don't lie." Isabella's face blanched, the color draining away to reveal the stark architecture of her bones. Then, her fear hardened into defiance. "You'll ruin us both if you side with her," she hissed, the word dripping with venom. "Think of the scandal, Julian, the family name." Julian's reply was steady, almost icy. "You've already ruined yourself, and you have sullied my family's name for the last time. This marriage is over." He slid a set of legal papers across the polished mahogany desk, an annulment drafted by his attorneys in the dead of night. Isabella's shriek echoed through the house, a sound of pure fury, but this time it carried no weight. It was the impotent rage of a queen who had been checkmated. Within a week, she would be gone, her name and her avarice severed from his fortune. Arthur sat in his usual chair by the window, the morning sun falling across his deeply lined face. When Julian entered, Arthur's weak voice carried a spark of its old fire. "That girl, Cassie, she stood like a soldier. Don't let her sacrifice be forgotten." Julian knelt beside his father's chair, the guilt of physical weight on his chest. "I wronged her, Dad. I believed the wrong person. I failed you both." Arthur's hand, thin and spotted with age, rested gently on his son's shoulder. "Then make it right, son. A good commander always makes it right." That evening, after hours of searching, Julian found Cassie at a modest diner off the post road. She sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, her sleeves stained with dried blood and rain. When his shadow fell across her table, she looked up, startled. Her eyes widened with a flicker of fear. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He sat down across from her, removing his expensive trench coat and setting it neatly on the seat beside him. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her face. The quiet strength that even exhaustion couldn't erase, the weariness in her eyes, the dignity that remained unbroken despite her tears. Finally, his voice broke the silence, raw and heavy with shame. "Cassie, I owe you an apology, a profound one. I saw the footage. I know the truth now. You didn't harm my father. You saved him." Cassie's lip quivered, her hands tightening around the cold ceramic mug. You believe me?" she asked, her voice cracking with the weight of that one. Simple question. Julian nodded firmly, his gaze unwavering. "I do. And I am deeply, profoundly ashamed that I didn't believe you when it mattered most. I let fear cloud my judgment. I let her manipulate me." His eyes lowered for a moment. "I am so sorry." Tears welled in Cassie's eyes, falling freely now. But they were no longer just tears of pain. They carried a trace of cathartic relief. She shook her head, whispering, "I was only doing what was right. Anyone would have—" "No," Julian said, his voice resolute. "Not anyone. You put yourself in danger when you had no obligation to. You bled to protect him. That kind of loyalty, it's priceless. It's a currency this world has forgotten." He slid a thick envelope across the table. Cassie frowned, hesitant, but opened it. Inside were documents. A new contract, appointing her as Arthur Sterling's personal caregiver and estate health manager, with a salary that made her gasp. Beneath it was a comprehensive medical benefits plan, one that would cover the full expenses for her mother's experimental cancer treatment back in Michigan. Cassie covered her mouth with her hand, a sob escaping her throat. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Julian said softly. "Come back. Help me give my father the peace and dignity he deserves. And let me help your mother. It's the least I can do after what you've endured for my family." Cassie's heart swelled, a tumultuous mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and nodded. Yes, I'll come back." Julian exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something like hope returning to the Sterling name. Back at the mansion, the staff whispered again. But this time, the whispers carried a different tone. The truth, delivered by Julian himself in a terse staff meeting, had begun to spread. Isabella's cruelty, Cassie's courage, Julian's swift reversal. Some still sneered, unwilling to let go of their envy, But many others now looked at the empty space Cassie had left with a newfound respect. That night, as Cassie once more sat beside Arthur's bed, she adjusted his blanket with gentle, practiced care. Arthur reached for her hand, his grip weak but warm. "Welcome home, soldier," he murmured, his eyes glistening. She smiled, her own tears shimmering in the soft lamplight, and whispered back, "I'm here, sir. I'm not leaving your side again." Outside, the last remnants of the storm had passed, leaving the air fresh with the scent of rain and renewal. The Sterling estate stood quieter now, its marble halls cleansed of one malignant shadow. Its silence was no longer heavy with fear, but filled with the fragile, tentative beginnings of healing. Cassie returned to the mansion the following morning, her steps slower, more deliberate than before, her spirit steadied by the monumental decision she had made in that diner booth. The rain had vanished, leaving the air crisp and the estate gleaming under the Connecticut sun. The white stone facade glistened as though it had been washed clean of its secrets. Yet, as she crossed the threshold, she felt the immediate weight of every gaze upon her. The staff paused in their routines. Silver trays were held mid-air, brooms halted their sweeping rhythm, and whispers rippled through the air like an invisible current. Some eyes held a glimmer of relief, even admiration. Others narrowed with a familiar suspicion or outright disdain. Julian had already announced his decision. Isabella was gone, her designer belongings packed and sent away under the discreet supervision of his legal team. He had introduced Cassie in the staff meeting that morning, his tone firm and unassailable. She was no longer a maid. She was his father's personal caregiver and health manager. It was a title heavy with responsibility and, perhaps more dangerously, visibility. Cassie's new quarters were no longer in the cramped, utilitarian servant wing, but in a small, elegant suite adjacent to Arthur's room. When she stepped inside, she was struck by its quiet dignity. A writing desk of polished cherry wood, a wide window overlooking the meticulously manicured rose garden, and shelves lined with medical texts and supplies, instead of the plain broom closet she once knew. She set her small, worn suitcase down gently, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the desk, her heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. This was more than she had ever expected, more than she felt she deserved. Arthur greeted her from his bed with a smile that crinkled the weathered map of his face. "My soldier," he said softly, reaching out a thin, veined hand. "You came back." "I promised I wouldn't leave your side," she answered, her voice soft as she settled into the plush chair beside him. She helped adjust his blanket, her movements careful and sure. "And now I have a proper excuse to stay." Arthur chuckled, a sound that was little more than a dry rasp, but it filled the room with a palpable warmth. "Julian told me everything. He finally saw the truth with his own eyes. I only wish it hadn't taken your blood to open them." Cassie lowered her gaze, her sleeve still wrapped over the healing, angry cut on her forearm. "It was worth it," she murmured. "As long as you're safe." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp, decisive knock at the door. Julian entered, carrying a leather-bound folder under his arm. His tailored suit was as sharp and impeccable as ever, but his eyes carried the deep, shadowed exhaustion of sleepless nights and moral reckonings. He nodded at Cassie with a quiet, profound respect. "How is he today?" "Holding the line," she said, echoing Arthur's own words back to him. "Good," Julian replied. He turned to his father, his voice softening. "I'll be in meetings for most of the day, but I wanted to tell you both. The legal proceedings are moving quickly. Isabella won't be a threat anymore." Arthur gave a faint nod, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Julian's gaze returned to Cassie. "And you? I meant what I said. You're not just an employee now. You're family. If anyone, and I mean anyone, gives you trouble, they answer directly to me." His tone was protective, but it carried a clear, cold warning meant to echo through the entire household. He knew how the whispers worked. After he left, Cassie walked the halls for the first time in her new role, carrying Arthur's detailed schedule in her hand. Medication times, physical therapy appointments, carefully planned meals. As she passed the main kitchen, she saw the staff gathered near the large stainless steel island. Their voices dipped, then rose again after she was out of earshot. "She's got the boss wrapped around her little finger," one of the senior maids muttered, her lips thin with envy. "Don't be ridiculous, Martha," another replied, her tone more measured. "You saw the security footage Julian showed us. She saved Mr. Sterling's life. Would you have done the same?" A third, a young valet with ambitious eyes, scoffed. "Maybe she staged the whole thing. Don't for a second think she's not clever enough for that." Cassie kept her head held high, her posture erect, though her stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. She had learned long ago that words could wound as deeply as fists, but she refused to let them bend her now. Her father's voice, a memory from a lifetime ago, echoed in her mind. "Stand straight, Cassie. Don't ever let the world break you." At lunch, she wheeled Arthur into the solarium. The light poured through the tall, arched windows, warming the air and casting long, dancing shadows across the chessboard he had left mid-game weeks before. She set out a simple, nourishing meal: grilled salmon, steamed asparagus, and wild rice, his favorite comfort foods. He ate slowly, his movements deliberate, and between bites he spoke, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You'll need thick skin, soldier," Arthur said, his eyes sharp and lucid despite his physical frailty. "These halls, they echo with more than just footsteps. They carry envy, fear, ambition. Isabella knew how to twist that poison to her advantage. Others will try too." Cassie met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I'm not afraid, sir. I know why I'm here. For you." Arthur's smile was faint but profoundly proud. "That's the spirit. Remember this, girl. Loyalty is a shield stronger than any steel." Later that afternoon, Julian summoned Cassie to his office. She stepped into the vast space, a sanctuary of power and influence. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound books, original paintings of stark New England landscapes, and the faint, pleasant scent of polished oak and old paper. Julian gestured to a worn leather chair across from his imposing desk. "There's something else," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "I've arranged for your mother's medical bills to be covered. Fully. From this day forward, her care is my responsibility." He held up a hand before she could protest. "It's not charity, Cassie. It's repayment. It is a debt of honor for what you've done for my father and for me." Cassie's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she touched the paper, reading the assurance of coverage, the name of the hospital in Ann Arbor, the figures that were so far beyond anything she could ever manage on her own. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the words into a haze of impossible relief. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know how to thank you." Julian leaned back in his chair, his expression earnest, stripped of his usual corporate armor. "You don't have to. Just keep doing what you've always done. Stand by my father. That's thanks enough for a lifetime." Cassie swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice soft but sure. "I will. I promise you." When she returned to Arthur's room that evening, she sat by his bed as he drifted into a light, peaceful sleep. The house was quieter now, though the undercurrent of whispers remained, a low hum beneath the surface of the estate's polite facade. She gazed at the folded flag on his nightstand, the flag that had been draped over the casket of his commanding officer, a sacred relic of a promise made on a frozen battlefield. It seemed to speak to her, a symbol of service and sacrifice that transcended wealth and marble walls. As dusk fell, she opened the window slightly. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming roses, a reminder of the storm that had passed. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and whispered to herself, a vow made to the quiet room and to her own resilient heart. I will not break. Not here. Not now. And for the first time in days, Cassie felt something stronger than fear. She felt the fragile beginnings of belonging, not in the mansion's imposing grandeur, but in the unbreakable bond she had forged with Arthur, and in the cautious, fragile trust of a billionaire who had finally, painfully, seen the truth. Outside, the lights of Greenwich twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars. Inside, the Sterling estate began to settle into a new, uncertain rhythm. But beneath its polished, perfect surface, Cassie knew that other battles still lay ahead. Battles of loyalty, of justice, of dignity. She tightened the bandage on her healing arm, straightened her shoulders, and prepared herself. For though Isabella was gone, the whispers in the halls were only just beginning. The Sterling estate stood gleaming under the Connecticut sun, a bastion of old money elegance, but within its white stone walls and glass-paneled windows, silence now carried a different, heavier weight. The immediate storm had passed. Isabella was gone, a ghost exorcised by lawyers and court orders. Cassie had returned to her role, no longer a maid in the shadows, but Arthur Sterling's personal caregiver, a figure of sudden and controversial prominence. Yet outside those formidable gates, the whispers had already begun to drift into the gilded circles of the wealthy, spreading like a contagion through manicured lawns and the high-walled gardens of Greenwich's elite. It started at a dinner party hosted by a neighbor, where Isabella's abrupt absence was the main course of conversation, served with raised brows and the clinking of wine glasses. "A messy divorce," one woman murmured, her pearl necklace gleaming under a chandelier, her eyes darting toward a maid refilling water glasses. Julian finally grew a spine. Another, a woman whose family had been rivals with the Sterlings for generations, scoffed. "Please, Julian has always been impulsive. Imagine throwing away a woman with Isabella's connections for some nobody." The stories twisted and mutated with every retelling. Some painted Cassie as a conniving seductress who had played the long game. Others imagined her as a schemer who had expertly staged a scene to trap her billionaire employer. Few, if any, believed the unadorned truth, that she had shielded a helpless old man from harm and paid for her courage in blood. Back inside the mansion, Cassie felt the crushing weight of those rumors before she ever heard them spoken aloud. She saw it in the sideways glances of the staff, in the subtle yet unmistakable shift in their demeanor. She saw it in the hesitation of a chauffeur who once greeted her with a warm, easy smile, but now avoided eye contact, his face a mask of professional indifference. She felt it in the nervous silence that descended like a shroud whenever she entered the kitchen. Her new position had lifted her from servant to caregiver, but it had also placed her in a harsh, unforgiving spotlight she had never sought. One afternoon, while helping Arthur with his gentle physical therapy exercises, Cassie overheard two maids whispering in the hall. Their voices were low, but the words carried clearly through the slightly ajar door. "They say she's clever, that one. Knew just how to twist the knife so Isabella would be the one to take the fall." The other lowered her voice even further, though the words remained sharp. "Clever or not, she'll never truly belong here. People like us don't get promoted to family, Sarah. We get replaced." Cassie's chest tightened. She continued adjusting Arthur's blanket with steady professional hands, but her mind echoed with their cruel assessment. Arthur, his senses still sharp despite his body's betrayal, looked up at her. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes. "Don't let them shake you, soldier," he murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. A battlefield is full of noise, most of it designed to make you lose your nerve. Only the steady survive. Julian, too, noticed the shift in the household's atmosphere and the poison seeping in from the outside world. At breakfast one morning, as he scanned the Wall Street Journal, his jaw hardened at a column buried in the society section. Sterling scandal raises eyebrows in Greenwich. Billionaire abruptly ends marriage, elevates former maid to position of prominence. The article dripped with insinuation, weaving half-truths into a tapestry of scandalous speculation. Julian folded the paper sharply, the sound a crack in the morning quiet. His voice was taut with anger. "They think this house is their personal stage for gossip and innuendo." Cassie, pouring Arthur's tea nearby, froze at his words, her hand hovering over the cup. Julian caught her expression, and his tone softened immediately. "I'll handle it. You've already been through more than enough." But gossip was a hydra, harder to silence than thunder. A week later, Julian attended a charity gala for the local hospital. Though he stood tall and imposing in his tuxedo, the whispers followed him like a malevolent shadow. "He's lost his mind. That girl must have something on him. Imagine, trading a thoroughbred like Isabella for a servant." Julian shook hands, smiled politely, and pledged a sizable donation. But inside, each whispered word dug a little deeper. When he returned home past midnight, Cassie heard the weariness in his footsteps echoing down the long marble hall. Arthur was awake, waiting in his chair by the window, a silent, sleepless sentinel. When Julian entered the room, he let out a heavy sigh. "The wolves are circling, Dad. They think I've been fooled. They think she fooled me." Arthur's gaze didn't waver from the moonlit lawn. "Let them think. The truth doesn't ask for permission. You saw what that girl did. She bled to protect me. How many of the people in those glittering rooms tonight would bleed for anyone but themselves?" Julian nodded, but a sliver of doubt lingered in his eyes. He carried not only his father's honor, but the immense weight of the Sterling legacy, a name etched into skyscrapers, foundations, and the very fabric of American finance. Protecting that name had always come before anything else. Now he wondered if shielding Cassie, doing the right thing, would end up burning it all to the ground. Cassie felt the change most deeply during her first solo outing since returning. She walked to a small, upscale market in town to pick up Arthur's favorite herbal tea. As she reached for the box on the shelf, she heard a sharp, disdainful voice behind her. "That's her, the Sterling maid." Two women, their manicured hands clutching designer handbags like weapons, stared at her openly. One whispered, loudly enough for Cassie to hear clearly, "I heard she trapped him with some elaborate sob story. These people always know how to play the victim." Cassie's face burned with a hot, spreading shame. She clutched the box of tea to her chest, forcing herself not to respond, not to let the tears that pricked her eyes fall. She hurried through the checkout line, the cashier studiously avoiding her gaze, and stepped back into the hot, glaring sun. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible again, but Arthur's voice echoed in her heart. "Steady, soldier." That evening, when she returned to the mansion, Arthur immediately noticed her downcast eyes and the tension in her shoulders. "Tell me," he urged, his voice gentle. And so she did, haltingly, her voice trembling as she recounted the whispers and the stares. When she finished, Arthur squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The world will always have its cowards, Cassie. They shout the loudest because they fear the truth. But truth doesn't need to shout. It just stands. And you, he tapped her chest weakly with his finger. You stand. Later that night, Julian came to her small suite with a folder. Inside were plans for a press statement and the launch of a new foundation in Arthur's name, one focused on providing care and support for aging veterans. They want to gossip about scandal? Julian said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. Then we'll give them something real to talk about. Dad's service, his dignity, your loyalty. That's the story that matters. That's the Sterling legacy. Cassie's throat tightened as she looked at the papers, at the bold mission statement. Mr. Sterling, I don't know if I'm strong enough for all of this attention. Julian shook his head gently, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You've already proven you're stronger than all of us. I owe you my father's life. And now I owe you the truth. The world will see you for who you are, Cassie, not who they whisper you to be. As she sat beside Arthur that night, the folded flag on his nightstand catching the soft glow of the lamp, Cassie felt a quiet, steely resolve settle over her. She hadn't asked for this battle, but it was hers now nonetheless. It was a fight not just to protect Arthur, but to protect the very idea of truth from the claws of rumor and the casual cruelty of privilege. The whispers beyond the mansion's gates grew louder with each passing day. But inside, Cassie straightened her shoulders, tended to her healing wounds, and prepared to face them head-on. For though society might sneer, and though envy might twist her story into something ugly, she had something none of them could ever take away. Loyalty, dignity, and the unshakable heart of a soldier. The Sterling estate had never felt so exposed. Reporters lined the manicured front gates, their cameras flashing like strobes each time a car pulled into the long, sweeping driveway. News vans, bristling with satellite dishes, cluttered the quiet country road, ready to broadcast every word that emerged from within. For days, speculation had swirled across tabloids and television alike, a tempest of innuendo and outright lies. Julian Sterling, the powerful billionaire heir, had divorced his socially prominent wife under mysterious circumstances and elevated a former maid to a position that had the entire city of Greenwich buzzing. Now, finally, he had called for a press conference to address the storm head-on. Cassie watched from an upstairs window, her stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. She could see the throng gathered below, a sea of umbrellas dotting the crowd as a light, persistent rain misted the street. Their collective voices rose and fell, a chaotic hum that seemed to vibrate up through the thick glass. She turned away, pressing her palms against her knees to steady herself. She had never spoken before cameras, had never stood before the judgmental eyes of the city. She had spent her entire life in the background, a silent, efficient presence in other people's lives. Now, because of a maelstrom of truth and lies, she was being dragged into the blinding, unforgiving light. Arthur sat nearby in his favorite armchair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, though his eyes remained as sharp and clear as ever. "Steady, soldier," he said, his voice a rough but unwavering whisper. "The battlefield looks different now, but the principle is the same. You don't run from the fire. You stand your ground." Cassie managed a faint, trembling smile, though a cold dread gripped her. "I'm not sure I can do this, Mr. Sterling. They'll twist everything I say. They already think I'm a liar." Arthur shook his head, a gesture of profound certainty. "The truth doesn't need polish, Cassie. It just needs courage. You speak it plainly, and you let them choke on their own lies." Julian entered the room then, his suit immaculate, his expression a mask of calm that only barely hid the tension coiled in his shoulders. "It's time," he said. He looked at Cassie for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, before adding softly, You don't have to speak if you don't want to. I can handle this." Cassie hesitated. She could have stepped aside, let him carry the full weight of the burden. It would have been the easy thing to do. But something deep inside, a voice that sounded a lot like her father's, told her this was not just his fight. It was hers too. She rose slowly from her chair, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll stand with you." The press conference was held in the grand foyer, where the majestic marble staircase curved behind a podium draped with the Sterling Foundation's new banner. The harsh, bright lights from the cameras bathed the room in a clinical glare. The air buzzed with the frantic energy of dozens of journalists jostling for the best position. As Julian stepped to the microphone, an expectant silence fell, broken only by the relentless clicks of camera shutters. "Good afternoon," Julian began, his voice measured and resonant. "I called you here today to put an end to the vicious rumors surrounding my family. Much has been said, and most of it has been false. Today, you will hear the truth." He paused, letting the words settle, commanding the room with his presence. "Several weeks ago, my father's life was endangered. Not by his illness, but by an act of betrayal. My former wife attempted to harm him in a moment of greed and unimaginable cruelty. That night, someone else stood between them, someone who put herself in harm's way to protect him." He turned then, extending his hand toward the shadows of the hallway. Cassandra Vance. The cameras swiveled as one as Cassie stepped forward, her pulse pounding so loud she thought it might drown out the silence. She stood beside Julian, her simple navy dress, which Julian's assistant had brought her, a stark contrast to the opulence around her. The lights were blinding, but she lifted her chin, steadying herself on Arthur's words. Julian continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "Cassie has been part of this household for 3 years. In that time, she has shown loyalty, kindness, and a depth of courage beyond measure. The rumors that she sought to harm my father or manipulate this family are despicable lies. I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. She protected my father at great personal cost, and for that, my family owes her a debt that can never be fully repaid." A reporter's voice cut sharply through the room. "Mr. Sterling, are you saying your ex-wife attempted to murder your father?" Julian's jaw tightened. "The evidence has been turned over to the proper law enforcement authorities. The matter is now in their hands." Another voice shouted from the back. "And what about Miss Vance? Isn't it true that she was fired and escorted off the property that very night?" Cassie's chest clenched. This was the moment of truth. Julian turned to her gently. "You don't have to." But she shook her head and stepped toward the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, a fragile thread in the cavernous room, then steadied as she found her footing. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "I was dismissed that night. I was accused of something I didn't do. It was the worst moment of my life." She paused, looking out at the sea of blank faces and lenses. "But I knew the truth. I knew Mr. Sterling needed me. And even when no one believed me, I could not and will not ever regret standing in front of him. Because it was the right thing to do." Her words hung in the air, simple and unadorned. Some reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Others lowered their cameras slightly, their expressions shifting from predatory to thoughtful. A hush fell over the room. One journalist, a woman from a major news network, asked sharply, "Ms. Vance, how does it feel to go from being a maid to the personal caregiver for the patriarch of one of America's most powerful families?" Cassie inhaled deeply, her eyes flicking for a second toward Arthur, who was watching from his wheelchair nearby. His subtle, encouraging nod gave her strength. "It feels heavy," she admitted with raw honesty. "It feels like carrying a weight I never expected. But it also feels like an honor. Because for me, this isn't about power or money. It's about doing what's right." Her gaze became more intense. "Mr. Sterling fought for this country when he was a young man. He deserves to live his final years with dignity, and if my part in that is to make sure he has it, then I will carry that honor every single day." The cameras clicked faster, flashes exploding in her eyes like small bombs. But she did not falter. Another question flew from the crowd. "What about your future, Cassie? Do you see yourself as part of the Sterling family now?" Her heart pounded, but she answered steadily, her words coming from a place of deep, unshakable conviction. "I see myself as someone who is doing her job with loyalty and love. Families are built on trust and sacrifice. If that's what we share, then maybe I am. But I never asked for a title. I only asked to be allowed to stand where I'm needed." The room stilled. The sheer, unvarnished sincerity of her words seemed to momentarily disarm even the most cynical journalists. Julian placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a silent, powerful gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any words. When the conference ended, the reporters erupted into a cacophony of noise, shouting questions as security began to usher them out. Julian guided Arthur back to his room, while Cassie slipped into a quiet hallway, her knees suddenly weak, but her spirit alight. She leaned against the cool marble wall, closing her eyes. For the first time since that stormy, violent night, she felt as though the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. In the kitchen, the staff whispered again, but this time, their tones were different. Some still doubted, their envy a stubborn poison. She played her part well, I'll give her that. Yet others spoke with a newfound awe. "Did you hear her? She sounded stronger than the boss himself." Fear and suspicion lingered, but respect, hard-earned and undeniable, began to sprout among the cracks. That evening, Cassie sat with Arthur by the fireplace. He reached for her hand, his voice raspy but thick with pride. "You stood before the world today, soldier, and you didn't break." Cassie smiled faintly, though tears welled in her eyes. "I was terrified." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, child. It's standing anyway. And you stood." Outside, the lights of Greenwich glittered against the dark hills, reflected in the mansion's tall, imposing windows. Inside, for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, freer. The truth had been spoken, a bell that could not be unrung. And though the world might still try to twist it, Cassie knew she had finally found her voice. And deep down, she understood. The whispers would continue, the challenges would surely grow, but she would no longer walk in the shadows. She had stepped into the light, and she would not turn back. The press conference had ended, but its shockwaves spread far beyond the stone walls of the Sterling estate. By the next morning, Cassie's face was on every major news site, her name trending across social media platforms she had barely used before. Some headlines were laudatory, celebrating her bravery. The caregiver who saved a war hero. Loyalty in the shadows of wealth. Others dripped with suspicion and thinly veiled contempt. Schemer or savior. The debate over Julian Sterling's new confidant, from maid to mansion, a modern-day fairy tale or a cunning deception. The world, it seemed, was sharply divided, and Cassie found herself at the epicenter of a storm she had never asked for. She sat in the solarium with Arthur, pouring his tea as the morning news played softly from a television mounted on the wall. A commentator's voice, slick and officious, filled the sun-drenched space. "Public opinion is split right down the middle, Bob. Some see Cassandra Vance as a working-class hero who risked her life to protect Arthur Sterling, a decorated Wubupwad veteran. Others, however, question the motives behind her sudden, dramatic promotion and the billionaire's decision to annul his high-profile marriage so abruptly." Cassie muted the screen, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't need to hear any more. Arthur, however, reached out with his frail hand and touched hers. "Don't let them rattle you, soldier. The truth doesn't sway with the morning headlines." Cassie managed a faint smile, though her chest ached. "It's not the headlines that scare me, sir. It's the people who believe the lies." Her fear proved prophetic when she ventured into town that afternoon. Julian had insisted she take the chauffeur and a security detail, but Cassie had gently refused. She needed to walk on her own 2 feet, to remind herself that she was still a person, not just a figure in a sensational story. She walked into the market with a short shopping list in hand, her modest dress clinging in the humid Connecticut air. At first, the aisles felt normal, the scent of fresh bread, the low hum of the refrigeration units. But soon, she felt the eyes. 2 women by the produce section whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "That's her, the sterling maid." The second one snickered. "Looks ordinary enough. Hard to believe she brought down $1 billion marriage." Their laughter felt like a physical sting, sharper than the cut that still throbbed faintly on her arm. At the checkout, the young cashier offered a polite, nervous smile, then hesitated. You're Cassie, right? From the news." His tone wasn't cruel, just filled with a gawking curiosity that made her cheeks burn. She nodded quickly, paid for her items, and hurried out. Outside on the street, a man called after her. "Hey, you're the sterling maid." His voice wasn't mocking, it was almost admiring, but the unwanted attention made her chest tighten with anxiety. She ducked into the waiting car, wishing for the invisibility she had once taken for granted. Back at the mansion, the staff was equally polarized. In the servants' hall, whispers had sharpened into outright arguments. One of the cooks defended her, his voice firm. "She saved Mr. Arthur's life. That's all that matters." But another, a valet with resentful eyes, sneered. "She just got lucky. Now she'll milk it for all it's worth." Their words carried down the corridor, reaching Cassie's ears as she carried Arthur's medication tray. She paused, her heart heavy, then straightened her back and kept walking. Julian called her into his office that evening. The day's newspapers lay scattered across his desk, their bold, accusatory headlines glaring up at them. He rubbed his temples, a gesture of deep weariness. "The board is restless. Our investors don't like scandal, even when it's built on a foundation of lies. They're pressuring me to distance the company from you." Cassie froze, the word landing like a stone in her gut. "Distance? How?" Julian looked at her, his eyes heavy with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "They want me to hire a professional caregiving agency for my father, to reframe the narrative, to make you disappear from the public eye." He paused, then his voice became resolute. "But I told them no. You stay. This house is your home for as long as you wish it to be." Her throat tightened. "Why would you fight for me, when it would be so much easier to let me go?" He leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "Because I was wrong once, Cassie. I will not be wrong again. You stood your ground when no one else would. That kind of integrity is worth more than all of their money combined." Arthur, overhearing the conversation from his adjoining room, let out a gravelly chuckle. For once, the boy's got his priorities straight. Later that night, Cassie sat alone in her suite, staring at her phone. Messages had flooded in from distant relatives she hadn't heard from in years, and from complete strangers who had found her on social media. Half were messages of profound support. "You're an inspiration. Thank you for standing up for Mr. Sterling." But the other half were knives disguised as words. "Gold digger. You'll ruin him. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Her hands shook as she scrolled through the venom. She set the phone down, covering her face with her palms. For the first time since that stormy night when everything had changed, she felt the full, crushing weight of being truly seen. And not all eyes were kind. A soft knock came at her door. She quickly wiped her eyes. It was Julian. He stepped inside, holding a folder. "I've arranged for media training, if you want it. Professionals who can help you handle the attention, craft your responses." Cassie shook her head. "I don't want to perform, Mr. Sterling. I don't want to be polished or scripted. I just want to do my job and take care of your father." Julian studied her for a moment, then nodded in understanding. "Then do just that. Let the world spin its stories. We'll answer with truth, not with theater." The next morning, as she wheeled Arthur into the garden for some fresh air, the old man looked up at her with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "They're calling you names, aren't they?" he asked. Cassie hesitated, then nodded. Arthur chuckled weakly. "When I came back from the war, they called us names too, said we were fools for bleeding on foreign soil. But we knew the truth of what we did. That truth kept us upright when all the noise tried to break us down. It'll do the same for you." Her eyes stung, but she smiled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Arthur said. "Hard, but simple." As the days passed, support began to swell from unexpected places. Veterans groups from across the country reached out, praising her loyalty to Arthur. Local churches sent letters, thanking her for embodying the values of dignity and sacrifice. A neighbor even dropped off a homemade apple pie with a note attached. Not everyone believes the lies. Keep standing. Yet the hostility remained, a persistent, ugly shadow. Outside the gates one morning, graffiti appeared, spray-painted in angry red letters, "Maid to Mistress." Julian ordered it scrubbed away immediately, but Cassie had already seen it. The words stung, but she refused to let them bend her. That night, she wrote a letter to her mother in Michigan, her handwriting steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Mama, they can say what they want. I know who I am, I know why I'm here, and I know that standing straight, like Daddy always taught me, is the only way through. Don't you worry about me. I'll keep fighting." When she sealed the envelope, she felt lighter. The world outside might twist her story into 1,000 different shapes, but inside the walls of the Sterling estate, she had a duty, and she would not abandon it. As she sat once more by Arthur's bedside, adjusting his blanket, she whispered softly to herself, "I will not break." And in that whisper, she found the strength to face whatever echoes the spotlight would bring next. The invitation arrived in a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a gold-embossed insignia. Julian handed it to Cassie at breakfast, sliding it across the polished oak table with an expression that was a mixture of pride and caution. "They're honoring my father at the Veterans Hall in Stamford," he explained, his voice low. "The city council and several veterans organizations want to recognize his service. They've also asked that you attend, as a guest of honor." Cassie froze, the envelope feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. She traced the seal with her finger, her chest tightening. "Me? But why?" Arthur, seated at the head of the table with his blanket tucked neatly around his legs, gave a raspy chuckle. "Because you're my soldier, girl. They know what you did. They know who stood guard when it mattered most." Cassie's heart swelled at his words, though a familiar fear crept in. The last time she had stood before cameras, her nerves had nearly undone her. Now she was being asked to step into a hall filled not just with reporters, but with decorated veterans, city officials, and strangers who had already formed their unshakable opinions of her. "I don't know if I belong at something like that," she admitted softly. Arthur fixed her with his steady, unwavering gaze, the same look that had likely steadied terrified young men on battlefields decades ago. Belonging isn't given, Cassie. It's proven, and you've proven it 100 times over. The morning of the ceremony, the Sterling motorcade pulled up to the Grand Veterans Hall in downtown Stamford. American flags lined the entrance, fluttering gently in the crisp autumn breeze. Uniformed men and women stood at attention, their medals gleaming under the Connecticut sun. Cameras flashed as Julian helped his father from the car, with Cassie close by, her simple navy dress modest but dignified. She felt the eyes on her immediately, some curious, some skeptical, others warm with recognition and respect. Inside, the hall was filled with the low hum of conversation. Old photographs of soldiers lined the walls, their faces frozen in sepia, timeless testaments to courage across generations. Arthur was guided to the front row, his very presence commanding respect even in his frailty. Cassie remained close, her posture straight despite the tremor in her hands. When the ceremony began, the master of ceremonies, a retired general with a booming voice and a chest full of ribbons, recounted Arthur's service. Captain Arthur Sterling, who led his unit through the hell of the Battle of the Bulge, whose valor saved countless lives. Today, we honor not only his service, but the enduring principles of loyalty and dignity he represents. Applause thundered through the hall. Then, the general's tone shifted, his eyes turning toward Cassie. But service does not end on the battlefield. In his twilight years, Captain Sterling found himself under threat, not from an enemy abroad, but from betrayal at home. And in that moment, one woman stood in the breach. She is not a soldier by training, but she has the heart of one. Ms. Cassandra Vance. The hall erupted with applause. Cassie's breath caught, her cheeks flushing with heat. She glanced at Arthur, who nodded proudly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Slowly, uncertainly, she rose from her seat and walked to the stage. The lights above were hot, the crowd's collective gaze overwhelming, but she forced herself to stand tall. The general gestured to the microphone. Cassie hesitated, then stepped forward. I don't really know what to say, she began, her voice trembling. I was never in a war. I was never given medals or a uniform. I was just doing my job. She took a breath, finding her footing. But when I saw Mr. Sterling in danger, I remembered something my father used to tell me. Stand straight, Cassie. Don't let the world break you. That night I stood because I couldn't do anything else. It was the right thing to do. A respectful silence filled the hall. She swallowed, her voice gaining strength. I didn't protect Mr. Sterling because of duty or pay. I did it because he reminded me that dignity matters, that even in weakness, a man who has given his all for his country deserves respect, and if I had to stand between him and harm again, I would do it every single time. The applause this time was deafening. Some of the veterans in the front rows rose to their feet in a spontaneous, silent salute. Cassie blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the wave of emotion. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled over coffee and pastries, veterans approached her one by one. A woman with silver hair and rows of medals clasped Cassie's hands in her own. You've got more courage than most people who ever wore this uniform, she said warmly. A younger veteran, his face scarred but his eyes kind, added, We fight overseas so people like you can fight for what's right here at home. Don't ever forget that. But not all voices were kind. Near the refreshment table, Cassie overheard a sharp, dismissive whisper. She's only here because of the scandal. Don't let the pretty story fool you. Another responded, Still, she spoke well. Maybe there's something to it. Their doubt lingered in the air like smoke, but the warmth of those who embraced her outweighed the sting. Arthur, tired but beaming, was wheeled beside her. "You did well, soldier," he said softly. "You carried yourself with honor. I couldn't have asked for more." Julian, too, stood at her side. For once, his public mask of cool control had dropped, replaced by genuine, unreserved pride. "You spoke from the heart, and they listened. That's more powerful than any speechwriter could ever create." As they left the hall, reporters swarmed again, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Cassie, do you see yourself as a role model now?" one shouted. Another asked, "Do you plan to stay in the Sterling household permanently?" The questions came fast and furious, but Cassie kept her words simple and true. "I'm just doing what anyone should do, standing up for what's right." That evening, back at the mansion, the atmosphere was lighter, less charged with suspicion. Staff who had once whispered now looked at Cassie differently. One of the maids even offered a quiet, tentative smile, murmuring, "You did good today, miss." For the first time, she felt a real shift. Not full acceptance, perhaps, but the solid, undeniable beginning of respect. Later, as she sat by Arthur's bedside, he drifted into a peaceful sleep, his breathing steady. Cassie gazed at the folded flag on his nightstand, its white stars glinting faintly in the lamplight. She realized then that she had stepped into a new kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with truth, dignity, and a stubborn resilience she never knew she possessed. She whispered to herself, the words now a steady, sure promise, "I will not break." And in that quiet vow, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead.